us know. It's my real pleasure to be hosting what is the third of our city forums, which are monthly events where local people can come together to explore and debate key issues or themes shaping our experience of the city. Last month we explored cycling and how to make Newcastle and Tyneside more cycling friendly, and in particular how to get more kids on bikes and to make it safe for them to do so. So that discussion I think leads very nicely on to this evening's focus, playing out and recreation. And I'm really delighted to have 4 speakers who will explore this subject from a range of perspectives. Each of them are going to give short presentations, some with slides, some without, and then we'll open out to questions and general discussion. I'm going to introduce each speaker before their presentation, if that makes sense. So Alison has kindly agreed to kick things off. Alison Stenning is Professor of Social and Economic Geography here at Newcastle University. Her research focus is on how playing out shapes residents' attachments to their streets and the people on them, and is interested in how play has the potential to challenge the erosion of relationships in everyday places. Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I am indeed a Professor of Geography, just literally up the road. But I'm also a Play Streets activist, and I'm going to kind of talk with both my kind of hats on today. So I research and kind of promote and develop and support Play Streets in a whole variety of different ways. So those of you that don't know, Play Streets are regular temporary road closures to create space for play, but also for hanging out, for meeting, for all sorts of other kind of incidental things that might happen when you open up a street for things other than cars. They're resident-led Play Streets, with a key role for councils in enabling, supporting and giving permission for residents to close their streets. It's a national, I'd say international now, movement started in Bristol in around 2010, and it's kind of spread from Bristol across the UK and beyond. There are a number of places here in the northeast, including Newcastle, that have Play Street schemes in place, more or less active. I run the Play Street scheme in North Tyneside. We've got a group called Play Meet Street. It's a kind of community voluntary group, and we've grown over the last, I think how long it is, 6 years now, from supporting about 10 streets. So there was another organisation that established it as a pilot and got about 10 streets up and running, including my own street. And from that we now have about 40 to 50 streets regularly involved across North Tyneside, and we've supported almost 100 streets across North Tyneside to close for play on at least one occasion. And like I say, most, about 40 to 50 of those do it every month. So usually on a Sunday, but sometimes on a Saturday, sometimes on an after-school session, for 2 to 3 hours, close their streets, stop cars coming through, and see what happens. Enable children to play, adults to meet, all sorts of other things go on. I was kind of, I'm writing a piece at the moment thinking about kind of Play Streets as social infrastructure. And I was kind of indulging myself this afternoon by writing a kind of sort of pen portrait of what happens on a street when we put the signs out, and I'm sure kind of Ali will talk about this in the context of a school street as well. It's like when suddenly children have the space to play, and indeed adults have the space to play or hang out or do whatever they do. And you see kids kind of, randomly bringing all sorts of different kinds of toys out, obviously bikes and scooters and footballs, but all sorts of, we've had Playmobil on the street, we've had football nets turned into dens, we've had obviously quite a lot of water over the years, skipping ropes, rugs, blankets, sand, I don't know, all sorts of, probably quite a lot of mud and insects and all sorts of other things too, and an awful lot of chalk. Chalk features extremely heavily in our Play Streets. It's kind of one of my favourite things, and my daughter's now 12, she was 4 when we started playing out on our street. We still play out every month. She was 4 when we started, and she's now 12, and she's slightly kind of less sort of, I don't know what the word is, approving of what her mother does. My thing is that I always draw a big smiley face in the middle of the street whenever we start to play. Sometimes it's got a cloud around it if it's raining, but yeah, kids then just fill the street with chalk, and I've got some amazing kind of, I should have brought some along, some images of the way that children fill their street with chalk, and they do it in all sorts of ways. They write their names, they do hopscotches and kind of obstacle courses and all sorts of like things like that. But it also just literally kind of make marks to fill the street. There was one occasion a few years ago when I kind of watched it, I guess probably 5 or 6 at the time. A little boy basically just literally the whole way down the street closer just did this kind of zigzag right down the way down the middle of the road where there would have been a white line on our street. It took hours doing it, probably the whole of the street play session. And the great thing about chalk is that, especially this time of year, it stays for quite a long time. So for kind of months, you can still see kind of the chalk markings. And we've done some experiments with so-called temporary spray chalks as well, which is kind of interesting because that can last literally the best part of a year. Didn't know that when but yeah, so there's this sort of kind of magic that kind of arises on a street. You know, all sorts of, you know, children come together in all sorts of kind of different combinations and kind of connections, I think, which I think is really interesting. A lot of intergenerational play, but a lot of play between children of different ages. And you know, those of you that have got kids or kind of know kids and hang out with kids will know that, you know, they get often very stuck in their school year groups, for example. They play with kids they get the same age as them, and whereas kind of historically there would have been much more of that kind of mixing on a street, and we see that. So we see the older kids looking after the younger kids, and you know, in a way going back to kind of having permission to play, you know, with dolls in a way that they might not do because they're too old to do so now. But also then, you know, a lot of kind of connections between children and adults, and between the adults on the street, not just the parents, but those kind of older people on the street without kids or without young kids who'll come out, have a cup of tea, bring a cake, start reminiscing about their own time playing on the streets and so on. So that's kind of what happens on a play street, and I think what I'm really interested in as a researcher, apart from kind of like enabling that kind of magic to happen, is to think about, well, what happens then to us and to our streets when we get a chance to play on them? And how does our relationship to the street and on the streets change? And so thinking about the kind of connections and friendships and relationships and support and exchanges and sharing that kind of goes on, but also that really kind of simple sense in which we just become more known to each other. We hang out, we play with each other, we talk to each other. You know, my daughter knows all of the adults on the street, and there's a sense of kind of security and safety that comes alongside that. But we, you know, through the pandemic, for example, on our street and on other play streets, we heard all of these stories of very swift shifts towards a system of kind of mutual support. But also how our relationship changes to the street. So we see the ways in which children and adults connect to the street in kind of new and embodied and tactile and detailed and kind of granular ways. So with the pavements, the camber, the potholes, the weeds, the trees, the bugs, the walls, the curves, literally kind of sitting in the middle of the road, which is a moment that I always love. So thinking about kind of what happens, the kind of things that emerge in the moment during the kind of period of the play street, but also kind of after, and what continues and what builds and kind of accumulates, I suppose, as the street gradually kind of doesn't always been playing out. Now on our street for 7 years, and there's quite a lot of streets in North Tyneside that have played out for a similar amount of time. What kind of accumulates, what builds, what's generated when those kinds of moments and opportunities are enabled, and that sort of kind of playfulness. That play creates a kind of looser space for children and adults. It enables these connections, this creativity, these ideas, these conversations, but also it kind of prefigures other kinds of experiences and imaginations and ideas and futures, I suppose, of what that space could be. So we get residents starting to talk about how actually could we make this more permanent? Could we put filters in the street? Could we create a space on the street for children to hang out and play more regularly? Could we think about how our street works? Could we think about what our street might look like if it was actually a space where children always felt like they could belong and that they weren't out of place? Could we imagine a street that wasn't dominated again by cars? Could we imagine a street that prioritises friendships and support and care, for example? And I think, I'll stop in a moment, I think, you know, thinking about kind of what can emerge and what can be created when we loosen up a space like a street, which tends to be increasingly seen as something that cars dominate. It's about cars, it's about moving to and from a place, it's about parking your car. Bringing children and their play and the play of adults and the wider community onto that street and reclaiming it just for a few hours every month starts to kind of open up these debates and these stories and these accounts of what kind of happens and how that works. But I suppose then what that also then throws up is what happens when that doesn't take place, when we can't play on our streets, when we can't reclaim our streets, and what are the kind of inequalities and concerns and fractures that might mean that some people are much more able to play on their streets, to reclaim that space, to feel entitled to claim the space in a way that others in other communities might not be able to. And I think that's kind of sort of what I'm really interested in at the moment, is how do we think about that question of play on the streets in the context of questions of social, spatial, and increasingly, I think, environmental justice. And I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Really fantastic way to get things started. So our second speaker is Alison Stenning from Sustrans. Ali is the School Streets Coordinator. School Streets programme tackles the congestion, poor air quality and road safety concerns that many schools experience. And they've implemented restricted car use on school streets with the aim of leading to lead to more children walking and cycling to school.
Yeah, whoever just saw me wildly gesticulating, I need to quickly grab my children's work from up here. Thank you very much. Yeah, so absolutely spot on. I'm the School Streets Coordinator for Sustrans North, and I've met a couple of you before. I used to be the School Streets Officer for Newcastle last year. Unlike Alison, I would say I'm not an expert in this field. All of my wisdom comes from about 7-year-olds, which is great. It's not quite the same as university education, but they have got so many ideas, and I kind of see a lot of my job as sharing those ideas that they have about their space with decision makers and people who can actually make them a reality, which happens to varying degrees across my patch. I'm going to talk with a couple of hats on, I assume, throughout the rest of the evening. I am a School Streets Coordinator at Sustrans, but I like to think I was a child not too long ago. I'm 24 and have spent time in schools across Newcastle, but I was brought up in the West End. I'm from Throckley, which I think shaped quite a lot of the way that I think about space. And also as someone who is now a homeowner out in the Great Park, where we aren't able to close our roads because they're not adopted by the council, so we aren't able to have things like play streets. We didn't do closures for the coronation, things like that. I don't have any children, that makes it quite difficult to meet other people on our streets, so I'd quite like to think about recreation not just for children but for adults as well. Yeah, so first of all, some ideas of what children would like to do if they had some space to do recreation instead of having a bunch of cars on their street. My colleague Helen, who's at the back, and I do this thing I call it Reclaiming Space 101, we call it parking space postcards for the kids. So everyone gets a little piece of paper and a weird amount of pom-poms and PVA glue, and they draw what they would do in a parking space if there wasn't a car there. And it's step one of thinking with early years and year one about what the space outside of our school should be for, and what the opportunities could be if we didn't have as many vehicles there, particularly at drop-off and pick-up time. Unfortunately, a lot of the school streets that we run, they're signage only, so there's not a physical closure. The aim is to reduce the amount of motor traffic on that street rather than completely close it, but we're looking to completely close things in the future. It's sort of like a pilot. This one's just quite sweet. It's just one that we picked up. Walk with my friend. We get all sorts of things, some of them more realistic than others. Lots of bike-related ones, I think, because we tell them where we're from, they assume we want to hear about bikes. We get lots of chalking, like Alison said. Kids would love to chalk if there weren't so many cars on the road. I had a reception boy at Casement Park who wanted to build a cinema in a parking space, dream big, I think. There are kids who want to have little beaches, like they want to take sand and have a little beach. They want to build a den. They want to bring their dolls and play dolls with their friends because they don't get to hang out with their friends when they're not at school. There's all sorts of things that kids as early years tell us that they would like to do, and they have the space to do it outside of that formalised setting, like outside of school. And if a lot of the kids that we work with don't have the space to do that kind of play at home. So yeah, if they had more space to do it, this is what they tell us that they would do. With older children, we do a bit of a deeper exploration of what the purpose of the land around their school is and how it makes them feel. We've been struggling a little bit with older kids at the minute, and I'm not an academic, but I personally think it's probably because of COVID and having been in one place for a really long time and not seeing things change that much. We're really struggling with the older kids in that they struggle to see what something could be like if it was better. so you can give them, I'm finding, you can give them blank canvas and they just do not know what to put on it. They're just used to things sort of staying the same or being bad. So as part of our Big Street survey, which has been running for years, we talk about journeys to school, we explore the local area around their school, do some little map skills for Key Stage 2 geography, think about how the place feels, and then we go in and we follow up a week later and we have sort of top trumps cards where they can like play them against each other, everything gets a score, and they sort of design infrastructure around their school based on what they want to see. So things are ranked on like how friendly they are for cars, how friendly they are for people or cyclists, how good they are for nature, how good they are for like air quality. So that's one of the ways that we do it with older children. And then particularly in signage only schemes, there isn't as much ownership of schemes as we would like. Like we don't get to have kids in the road chalking and physically playing in the road. But we want them to feel at least a little bit of ownership of the project and a little bit more ownership of that space. So we work with them on the marketing materials for school streets, which go up around the school. So they design their own posters and say what they want to do instead of people driving there. This is what this space should be for. So that's, I guess, it's not as in depth because we do a lot of stuff with each school, but it's a little bit of a taster about the way that we work with kids to help them envisage what a space could be like when they're not experts in active travel design or like play spaces or whatever because they're 7. So this is the way that they get to tell us about it, and it's the way they get to have a big think about it, and then we get to take it to decision makers and see if we can make it work. I'm going to leave it there, but I've got a lot more to say, but it's not particularly coherent yet, so we'll leave it there for now if that's alright.
Thank you very much. That seemed extremely coherent, so thank you very much. So our final speaker, and I think, are you going to speak together or separately? How are you?
I think I'll be introducing what we do
Fine,
first,
okay.
and then she'll be talking about her project.
Terrific. Well, I'll introduce you first. So Anne-Marie Gadares and Alicia Sanchez, who are talking about projects for change, which provides youth-led projects for young people. They work to maximise young people's potential by supporting them to direct services to meet their needs, leading to positive outcomes and a brighter future. Alicia is a youth worker at Projects for Change, and Anne-Marie is an artist, and I believe they'll both be talking about a project to save the Blake Law skate park. Good. So over to you.
I don't really have any notes, so I'm just going to ramble off of what we do at Projects for Change. It's a youth-led charity that's based in the west end of Newcastle, mainly Cowgate and sometimes Blakeflow. When me and Anna, we were both young people who participated in Projects for Change, where my now boss Kelly was our youth worker, and now I am a youth worker at Projects for Change. So we work with groups of young people, talk to them about like what's important to them, the issues that they face, what generally just like allowing them the space to talk about how they feel and like what they kind of wish to see a change in their environment, which what you guys were saying like really hit home for me personally, because it's what I see a lot at work. We have drop-in sessions at this our space called Betty's Hut and Garden. They do it's very much youth-led, and so what they want to see in the space, we try our best to incorporate that in what we can do within our, like, I don't know what's the word. Facility. Yeah, that's the word. So the chalk and stuff, chalk all the time, everywhere. On our decking, on the street, but obviously we have to be quite careful with like, it's not necessarily a busy road, but there are still cars that come by quite quickly like just out of nowhere. So we're like, yeah, you can do it on the street, but just be careful. The project that we're talking about mainly is the Blakelaw Skate Park. A few years ago, back in like late 2020, we couldn't have like delivery sessions like with where people could just come in. So we went out onto the streets to talk to some young people and ask them like how they were, how's like the lockdown going for them. We found out that being on detached, that there was a particular space which was the skate park, where they would go and like, because they had bikes, scooters, skateboards, what have you, and it was a common meetup place for a lot of the young people in the area. But as it was getting into winter and it was getting darker, there was no space for them to go because the skate park wasn't well lit. So we tried to inquire about maybe getting some lights in the skate park, and then that's when we came across an article about the fact that there was going to be a new build in Blakelaw Park, which at first incorporated the skate park into their plans, like redoing it, repaving it. It sounded really nice, and then a few weeks go by and then it was just scrapped from the plans, and that's what Anna's artwork was about.
Hello, I'm Anna. I work in Project for Change as a youth support worker / community artist. So I've been in this project since I was university, like Elijah said, and now I'm working there. So when I found out about this, I've recently graduated from university, and when I was in my second year, I was doing a project that had to relate within society. So I found out about this through Elisha, and I wanted to use all the material that she's got about this from the opinions of young people, and I made an exhibition called Stolen, which really narrowed down the feelings and emotions of the young people, having no power within trying to keep something that they used all the time, that they used frequently, and is their safe hub and safe space outside of Project for Change in the community centre, since we're only open for so many hours, so afterwards they would go into the skate park. Can I get the... Yes, thank you. So this piece is called Timeless Skate Park, so it gives you an idea of what the skate park used to look like. So it is a GIF, and I believe it is 16 panels, and I hand drew them in Photoshop, and I laid them on top to create this, and it's back and forward of what the skate park used to look like, and then what it looks like now. So the plans, like Elisha said, the whole park was going to be remade. The sports hub is currently there, but the fields are also there. They were going to add new football pitches, tennis courts, that sort of thing, but it's all guarded and you had to pay for membership to use it, which most of the young people in our area do not have the money to do that. And this facility for the skate park, it was free for them, and they can come any time of the day. So really it's that I'm just showing what it used to look like, and there's a little phrase that our young people used to say, and especially after when it's gone, they thought that the skate park was the best thing in Blakelaw, since we're a very small community and it's around a bus ride to get to town, and the nearest skate park would be Exhibition Park. So really even using money to take transport to go into town would be a lot for them, especially as kids and their bikes and so on. The next slide, please. So this piece is part of a collection I called it Currently at Blakelaw, and I think this is, if I remember correctly, the third photo, there's 5 of them, and I went into Blakelaw Park when the sports hub was in construction, and I kind of went over some bars when I shouldn't have, especially when it was blocked off. And I took pictures of the construction, and after taking loads and loads of pictures, this was one of the pictures that I decided to contribute, as it really shows that sort of, oh, you can't come here anymore, not just because it's under construction, but because when the sports hub is being built, I don't think the young people, especially on project, would be able to come in and use it, especially since you don't have that much money. And I added, so in the 5 pictures that I've shown, Elisha, when she went to go speak to the young people and asking them how they were doing, especially in lockdown, and then them finding out about the skate park, they gave some comments on how they were feeling about the skate park being taken away. So I've contributed some of their thoughts where I put it on acetate, and I wrote acrylic marker on top. And then the next photo is also another photo that, so there's the construction, that's what the sports hub scaffolding looks like, and
Okay, thank you very much. So, everyone get their presentations nice and short, so we have lots of time for questions and discussion. This is meant to be very much a kind of open forum dialogue. It's not meant to be a kind of Q&A session, although I guess this setup may lead in that direction. So I want to kind of throw it open initially to all of you. Do you have any comments, questions, things you'd like to say? Otherwise, I will happily kick things off. So anyone? Yes, we do. Fantastic.
So what stage are you at with the community skate park then, about getting it opened up? Is it?
Well, at the moment, since there was a lot of with the council and the community, they've heard about the fact that we really didn't want the rest of the field to be taken away. So they built the sports hub itself, but then the rest of the football fields and all tennis courts and so on, I think they've stopped and they haven't done it, so the field is still there. But then, as a result, the skate park that they took away, it's still gone. Is there an update? I didn't know that.
No, just that at the time, we're like Projects for Change are a small charity. We don't have a lot of power, particularly because there's been a lot of funding cut in youth work, and I think we're one of a few youth charities left in Cowgate and Blakelaw. So there's not a lot we can do about like trying to get it back in, considering the issue that they had with the skate park was that it was considered a place where illegal like drugs were being sold and like antisocial behavior and all that stuff, but it's because there were no lights in the park in the first place, so it kind of allowed for that behavior to kind of happen.
Really, what's next for this is to try and let people know that this is happening, and even I know that the council goes into deprived areas like this that felt like they need some sort of economic opportunity. So with the sports hub, it'll bring in jobs, and it'll bring in outside communities that would want to use the football fields, and it'll pay for it, and it'll generate more income in the area. But at the same time, the community that is within the area care about what happens and what goes on there, and it really shows the young people trying to take ownership in what they want, and really showcasing to the council that this is what we want. We want the skate park, we want more free use. Sports hub can be there, of course, but it's really important to have these free recreational spaces.
Is that alright? It's on actually both your points about you being a really small charity, and also about the communities that you work in, sort of having things done to them rather than being able to be part of, like making the solution. Because if your community, like if the community that you work in was designing the solution, the skate park would be like back right now. It would never have gone, or maybe it would like be even better. I found with like not having a background in this stuff at all, working out how to do stuff is probably one of, other than like the finances, working out how to do stuff and who to speak to and what the process is for like making that change is one of the biggest barriers, especially to communities and small charities and like grassroots campaigns getting this stuff done. Like there are so many people in this city with really great ideas. It's just so bloody difficult to do it. So I guess there's like a bigger thing to be done about like linking up people like you and the young people that you work with, and the young people that I work with, and the young people that you work with, and working out how to actually like navigate the way to do things. Do you know what I mean? That's quite vague, but like
even like trying to get lights for the
it's
skate
a
park,
nightmare.
it was like I was like, where do I start with this?
Yeah.
Who do I go to? Who do I speak to about this? There was like, it's just where, how.
I think it's really interesting the way you described what kids were doing in the park. That some people view that as antisocial behaviour, but it's actually that's play is social behaviour, and we're not facilitating it. You know what I mean? And then if you displace it, then the play and the social behaviour happens where you perhaps don't want it, and then you might perceive that it is antisocial behaviour. And it's like that's I'm incensed by the loss of your skate park, and I'm angered by that. But you know, I think it shows the importance of community engagement in when we're making changes to places.
I mean your point about cuts in the youth sector, and that's also true in play work. I mean there's almost no play work at all across the northeast as play work in that form. And I think, and then the loss of hundreds of playgrounds across the country and across the region. There's dozens across the region as well, and that loss of and things that either are kind of left to go to ruin, or and then as you say, then what happened? It's the children and teenagers are displaced and then seen as a problem, and then you get kind of people bemoaning the fact that kids just sit at home on their tablets. And we know, from decades of research that if you give kids the opportunity to play out in spaces that they feel are safe, whether it's teenagers or small kids, then that's where they'll choose to play. They won't choose to be on screens, not some of the time, but largely that's not what they'll choose to do. And yet it becomes this now kids today. So if you destroy the spaces in which children want to play, children and teenagers, then what do you do? And I think, there was I think Rishi Sunak made an announcement the other day about, apparently millions of pounds of investment into extending the hours of youth clubs. I'm saying, well, which youth clubs' hours are you going to extend? And then this idea that it's kind of, nothing like what's been lost from the sector, whether youth work or play work. And I think, it's like sort of talking to kind of people who've been involved in youth work and play work across the northeast, for the last sort of 20, 30 years, and see these kind of cycles of decline. And I think that, and I was talking to someone the other day who was kind of hoping that there would be this kind of uptick, and maybe kind of Rishi Sunak's announcement's part of that, but only because people are increasingly concerned about antisocial behaviour, not for any other reason. It's just, and then it will just be this responsive kind of wave of funding, and then it will be withdrawn again. It's, it's just, pretty terrible.
So, we've talked a lot about having to make changes retrospectively to try and encourage play, recreation in what we have already. Obviously we need to build more houses, that's just kind of a fact. We are building more houses in areas. We're also looking now at having to build up rather than just across as well. How can we ensure that as we are building houses for the future, as we're making those new streets for the future, how do you all think we can best ensure they are suited for play, for recreation, for creating a space for young people? What do you think we need to maybe do differently? Whether it's simply just work with groups to find out what they want from the areas that there's going to be, or whether it's a fundamental design change in how streets actually work.
I feel very nepo big, you're replying to this one. I I have many thoughts. I think number one, build LTNs. Like Tom and I live on the Great Park, and it is a new build and should have been built with, you know, active modes of transport in mind and like the safety of the people who are going to live there. But oh my god, the traffic on the Great Park is a nightmare. So no wonder no one plays out. Like even if we could close the streets, which we can't, like you, as far as I'm aware, you don't really get kids playing out, at least not in our bit, because it is a nightmare for traffic and it is really unsafe and the road markings aren't done properly and all of this. And then in terms of engaging with community groups, I think one of the solutions is like longer term funding. I don't know what you guys are like, but we're funded on a year by year basis, so you can do all sorts of work within communities and then your funding stops, and as much as we'd love to carry on doing the work, people have got bills to pay, like you can't, most people can't keep doing it out of the goodness of their heart. And if you get 1 or 2 years of funding at a time and then you have to drop it, and then so I was as far as I'm aware, the first schools officer in Newcastle after the DIY Streets project stopped being funded, so came in, and even that was while I was at school, the DIY Street stuff, so it must have been 6-7 years ago, and pretty much from day one people were asking me questions about it and they still wanted to like input into that. If we kept going with DIY Streets, it could have been a really, really great project and people still have all that input that they want to put in and people are still invested in it, but we can't do anything with all that feedback that we've got. So I think longer term investment in either hiring people to work in local authorities or wherever to do that engagement in-house, or longer term funding agreements with specialists is probably a good place to start.
I think relationships with communities are particularly important because, like you said, with like funding and stuff, you can go into a community and be like, what do you want? Like, what kind of stuff do you want to see in your area? But then you'll have to withdraw because there's no money left to continue that project. And to me, it feels like it should be more than just like money and like funding and stuff, but because what's going to be in that area is going to be there for a long time. And like relationships particularly, especially if you've been in an area for a long time, they like grow and like develop, and I think it's having those relationships with the people in the community like a more important than like how many houses are going to be built in that area. There's a lot of layers to it, I would say.
I also think that within new communities and new house building, it feels very shiny and new, and it doesn't feel like a community centre can be built within that new community or something like that. But maybe instead of something where the community has to be part of it to make it feel like a community, can build places like playgrounds and skate parks, a place where kids can just go and have it accessible and for it to feel safe with the lights and maybe a gate, and when it's late at night and the lights are turned on, even so parents are okay with having their kid go there because they know that it's in their safe new community building area. Because from experience as well, well, not from Project for Change, but I live in the city centre of Sunderland, and in the Sunderland city centre there's no community space that I'm aware of, but I know there's a park, Mulberry Park, that's nearby, but no kids go there, especially after like 5 or 6 in the afternoon. They hang around like near Mackey's or outside of Metro, and they had to get police to guard them, so like they're not allowing these kids, but they have nowhere to go, and they need somewhere where, apart from the community settings and youth workers and community centre where they feel like they can be part of something, they need somewhere to just go and be kids and hang about that isn't just their house.
Yeah, I think there's some increasingly amazing examples of new developments in which space for play, but also space for community. other kinds of connections that are built in from the start, but they're rare, and you know, they're often kind of cheek by jowl with other kind of more standard new developments which have none of that space, and the kind of marked contrast between those kinds of developments I think is really clear. I mean, I think there's some really interesting people kind of doing some work, I mean, both kind of in architecture and kind of development, but also academics kind of writing about this as well. But I think that sort of the disconnects, I think, between kind of some of the best examples of those kinds of new developments that have those kinds of spaces kind of integrated, and the worst, I think, is so marked. And kind of, so I think Harriet Grant, who's a journalist for The Guardian, she writes quite a lot about kind of play, but particularly around kind of social injustice and inequalities in the context of play. And she's kind of revealed all of these kind of accounts of new developments, particularly in London, but I know she's kind of been looking elsewhere as well, where, you know, so where there is a kind of where, you know, where a proportion of the new development is social housing, but the people, the families, the children living in that social housing are excluded from the playgrounds and the green spaces that are built within the wider development, and that's happened so many times, despite, you know, all sorts of kind of agreements and arrangements as the development begins. And I think, you know, there's a real question of power and where the money lies and who's making these decisions and how they're enforced. But then also, you know, that there's a capacity then within, you know, and so Harriet, you know, reports kind of some of these amazing stories of women, particularly mothers, who have fought, you know, tooth and nail for their children to have access to these brand new playgrounds that are built on their doorsteps, often on the site, as you say, of things that have been removed from the community kind of historically. So I think there's some some amazing examples of things that could happen, but there still seems to be an awful lot of kind of structural reasons why that stuff doesn't happen.
And on the structural reasons front, I think there are some really good examples, like you said, like in South Cambridgeshire, they're like, I can't remember exactly what it is that they've done, but sort of upended their planning process. So like I can't even remember what she told me now, but they do like a bunch of community consultation first rather than taking plans to the community and the community saying, no, get your hands off our field, we don't want it, but we're in a housing crisis and which is great. And, you know, we're talking about people needing to do really strong engagement to get money from the Active Travel Fund and what have you, that's excellent, but it needs to be engagement, I think, by people who are experts in engaging with marginalised communities. Like the kids that you work with, as a kid who grew up in the West End, are not being consulted on decisions by the people who are making them, if that makes sense. Like if you can't tell from how I am now, there was a housing development being proposed for near where I lived when I was a teenager in Throckley, which has now been built, and I was 14 at the time. And again, if you can't tell from how I am now, I was a really annoying teenager. So I went to all the community drop-ins, and I went, but all these kids are going to have to go to Wallbottle, and Wallbottle's already full, and you can't get in. And anyway, like my friends went there, and they were bullied, and like people won't want to go to that school. Wallbottle is excellent now, but when I was a kid, it was a bit. And lo and behold, all the kids have moved in, and they've gone to Ponteland because no one thought to actually speak to children and about children's needs. And there's no play space in that development. The kids have got nothing to do, so now we've got an issue in Throckley of like kids. But it's not an issue, but they're just going and hanging out outside Sainsbury's. The other hot take is ban community Facebook groups, because now people are just complaining in community Facebook groups. They're like, oh, there's kids outside Sainsbury's. I'm like, where else are they supposed to be? You've got a road, you've got Sainsbury's, or you've got the doctors. I don't know where you want the kids to go. So having those people involved from the get-go, but having people, if you are going to program engagement into your scheme, whatever that scheme may be, having people who are experts in working with various communities, whether that's people of colour, people of marginalised genders, children and young people, and I think teenagers and students, controversially, like teenagers and students want to hang out, but there's nowhere free to hang out, and everyone's skin, like no one did. like it's just sort of part and parcel of being a teenager, is you've got no money. I don't know where you're supposed to hang out except maybe causing bother outside McDonald's. Like, probably the only fun thing you can do. You can't afford to go in and like buy yourself a meal because you're 13.
I had a great story the other day actually talking about Facebook, because you're right, you know, in the world of play streets, clearly there's an awful lot of disgruntlement about, you know, kids playing out and kicking balls at cars. But someone was telling me a story the other day who lives on a new estate actually in North Tyneside, in kind of northern kind of bits of North Tyneside, and she was telling me that their Facebook group has suddenly had this kind of turnaround like in recent weeks, and actually now there's parents like sharing kind of like, or ask, you know, parents kind of basically as a kind of intermediary for trying to get kids to hang out together. So like, you know, a couple of 12-year-olds kind of on the estate who didn't know each other but both wanted to kind of play out and hang out, and then there's this kind of sort of like, you know, play date matchmaking going on through this community Facebook page. So it can be turned to, and kids have started playing out in this. So one of the reasons why they weren't, apart from kind of all of the stuff around kind of cars and design and stuff, was because actually they were all at different schools, they didn't really know each other, and suddenly like this kind of matchmaking thing going on.
And you're not out and about and passing people because you're at school, being driven home, staying at home, like you're not going to meet people when you're out and about.
So there's potential in those kind of Facebook groups.
Yeah.
Let's hope in social media. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up, if I just read it. I just wanted to pick up on that question around relationships, community. That's what I'm hearing. Okay, relationships, community, process, and the structures needed to enable this to happen. A lot of the times, it's the people who don't have the power, including researchers, you know, and people like yourselves and the community who have to come up with solutions after they've been wronged, or these injustices have been done. But I also think there's a question of ethics here. I mean, we are in the 21st century and ethics are being raised as we speak, you know, I think anyway. So what happened to, you know, corporate social responsibility from these big house builders, I don't know what you call them. I mean, that was a term that was being bandied around a bit. So, you know, it's kind of too late, actually, to bring a plan to a community, to even start talking to a community. You need to have that. Those builders need to have that as part of their structure. When they speak to a council to build on land, houses, yes, very important, that needs to be inbuilt and embedded and incorporated. And so that's where the community, the play workers, the community is also, the people who come to build, they're part of that community as well. It's not just the community with small c, you know. So I just wanted to bring that point up, and if anybody has any response to that, you know, does that happen at all? Is there a good example anywhere?
It's not like a new idea, it's an old idea. I mean, if you look at the Biker Wall, you know, that was all incorporated, you know. There was like a place for young children, young people to play. It was safe. Everybody knew each other. Families, you know, knew each other. They knew all the kids, you know. So, I mean, I come from Belgrade in Serbia. It's the city that is built on two rivers. So there's an old Belgrade and new one. New one was built after the Second World War. Mostly concrete tower blocks, all looking pretty much the same. However, in between, amongst all these buildings, there were always like places for young people. There were always sports courts like for basketball, football, tennis. Places where people can congregate, like not just children but the older ones. So everybody again knew each other. We're talking about like really, you know, tall buildings, like so. It's possible, but you know, these days the price of the land determines everything. Profit, you know, determines everything, and people's lives are not important anymore. We are supposed to go to work, go home, lock ourselves, and you know, go to sleep, and then next day go to work. Maybe for the weekend go to the park.
I think
and
that
play.
would happen under communism, and what would happen?
Yeah.
I don't know what we call it now. Sorry, I don't.
Why it's socialism? That's why I know it's better.
It's not a policy.
I can say something, but I'm chair,
Yes,
so I'm not really.
I'm going to keep my mouth shut because I just have lots of thoughts about housing.
I
I do not necessarily want to put under my employer's name.
Sort of two.
Karen,
Yeah, like, so I mean, interesting. Like before, like I mean, over the last sort of, I guess 15, 20 years or so, most of my research has been in the UK. But prior to that, I researched in Russia and Poland for years, and I'm obsessed with new towns. Always, I was born in a new town. I get dragged back to them, whatever I try and do. At the moment, I'm kind of thinking, killing work. Now, what can they do there? But anyway, so I worked for about 15 years. I researched in Nowa Huta in Poland, which was built as Poland's first socialist city. And I mean, I wasn't particularly researching children, and I was, I guess, doing much more stuff around kind of families and households. But yeah, so that was, it was all, I mean, there was all sorts of kind of questions about whether it was built as a kind of surveillance state, but because it was built as a surveillance state, it also meant that there was, you know, that families and apartments were constantly overlooking the spaces that were then created for children. And so yeah, so all of the kind of courtyards had play spaces and playgrounds and courtyards and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah. My kind of, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I know less about housing developers actually and builders, house builders. But I think there's some interesting stuff going around at the moment amongst housing associations. And one of the things that I work nationally with Playing Out, the organisation that supports Play Streets, and we're focusing quite a lot of our work on working with housing associations, particularly to get no ball game signs ripped down and not put up in new estates. But I mean, you know, recognising that housing associations control an awful lot of the space in an awful lot of communities, particularly those that are more disadvantaged. So, you know, and recognising the power of housing associations to shift relationships between tenants and to kind of give children and young people a voice, but particularly to do that in symbolic ways, like refusing to have no ball game signs on their estates and stuff. So I think there's some really, really powerful stuff that can be done with housing associations. And I think there's some really good housing associations kind of that are starting to do that kind of work and really kind of investing in and thinking about that kind of sort of pro-play policy that you could instigate in estates that are owned and managed by housing associations. But yeah, so.
I think linked to your point and what you've just been describing there as well, I don't know if you're aware of what's been happening in Rotterdam and in Copenhagen, but they've been using roof space an awful lot more, so that play has been sort of redefined in many respects and relocated, and that's a novel idea in many respects. I think in Rotterdam in particular, it's been able to be facilitated because of the fact that lots of the city was destroyed during the war, and the new buildings were of a particular type and kind of uniform, and that might be the case in some other places as well. But I think that's been very successful, and Rotterdam hold a festival of looking at how innovative the use of roof space has been in May or June, and that's happening every year now. So that's another area.
It wouldn't be allowed in this country due to
health and
safety.
Health and safety guidelines.
Yeah.
I think there's two things I wanted to add, if that's all right. Just on using space that's not sort of outdoor communal space. This is probably less on play streets and recreation. But when Tom and I's first place together, it was a studio flat that we rented, and it was hell on earth. But the nice bit, it was a lovely flat, but having two adults in one room is well. But in the building that we lived in, there was like a communal space that was free to use. You just had to book it with the blokey who sort of ran reception and stuff. And it was lush because we lived in that building. There were loads of like international students, because this was when I was in my final year? Second year. So it was students only, but there were loads of international students, and they would like book out the little dining room that was downstairs because no one had a table in their flat because they were tiny, and like teach people to cook food from their country, and like people would do swaps of food, put on dinner parties. We did like Love Island watch parties that like it probably wasn't the wholesome kind of recreation that we want to be talking about, but it was a cracking way to meet people. Like it was so good. And just having a space that was free to use, that was where you lived, even if people are in these little sort of rabbit hutches, having a place where you could come and hang out and it was free, and you might just meet around a person, and they had free books that you could read and just sort of exist in a space with other people was really, really nice. And the other thing about developers, this is with businessy people way over my head, so I might explain it wrong. But I was talking to someone recently about active travel stuff, and they were saying, I'm fed up of speaking to developers, and I'm fed up of speaking to local councils. Like things just get backtracked. I can't remember what's that money called? Do you know when developers?
It's 26 or SIL.
That's the one. They're like, oh, they go back on what they're doing with that, and like the developers are rubbish. I'm going to the people who are funding the developers. So they went to this. Is it UK Reef, like the big sort of estatey thing, to like hobnob with people who fund developers about like why it essentially is a good thing for them to only be funding development. I don't know how successful it was, but I think I can definitely empathise with being a little bit fed up with trying to deal with people
higher
who
up, you go when
and I, you know, there is an extent to which you can trust what people with loads of money are going to do with it, but
It sort of feels, it sort of feels like a top-down
Yes, yeah.
approach is needed with some of this going to the power, but then also
you've sort of got to attack it from all angles.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I mean, I think it's the way the city evolves, you know what I mean? And you've got to kind of think about the competition, you know, or commerciality about developing kind of greenfield new build housing. Why is that? Does that appear on the surface to be attractive to people, and why do people move out there? And when they get there aren't the facilities, there aren't the schools, there aren't the play areas, there aren't the shops and things like that. You know, and I think for those, for one of the things, the reasons why I got into doing what I'm doing is I felt like the developer had a plan for a new build. You know, somebody was drawing a suds and somebody was drawing a play area, no matter how bad it was, you know, one swing, you know, and you think, oh God, you know, who designed that as a soulless play area, you know, one thing in it. You know, but they had visitors parking and they had all the rest of it, you know, and then you think, what about the communities that exist already? Nobody's doing that change for those communities that exist already, you know, and that's one of the drivers why I'm so passionate about changing, you know, kind of and facilitating change in the area that I represent, in terms of we've got the LTN in as a trial, we've got the school streets in as a trial, we're beginning to spend the 106 money that's sitting there and has been unspent. And Tuesday night I was at a play area consultation trying to talk to families about what they wanted for their play area, and the conversation was, we don't see kids play out here. And I was like, have you seen the play area? There's 2 metal frames where the swings used to be, and that's it. There's nothing there. You know, you can't build a play area based on who uses it now. You build a play area on who you want to use it in the future and for generations to come. You know what I mean? It's kind of, you want to facilitate change, I think, you know what I mean, or at least evolution. You know, and I think cities need to evolve to survive, don't they?
I guess for me, in terms of that, thinking about how do we bring people along, it goes back to what you're saying about the inequalities, and how do we make sure that communities feel empowered to reclaim those spaces, because the developers aren't going to offer it up. So it is where you need those different angles in that.
Comment or question right at the back?
Well, it's related. I was just thinking, there was a planning bill that government, I don't know if it's gone through or not, but basically part of it was requiring that like new developers would have to like give a portion of money for like social housing or something else. And like, could there be a scheme where if you're developing a new housing estate, there's like minimum requirements for like community spaces, like community gardens, playgrounds, playgrounds. But also another thing to do with like accessibility and stuff. I mean, the thing with like playgrounds is that a lot of disabled children, there's like when you see children playing, often they're able-bodied, and like lots of playgrounds, disabled children can't play to because of the ground, if there's like wood chip or the types of play equipment they have, like having like minimum standards for what like playgrounds should look like to ensure that everyone can access them. And then, I don't know, this is obviously, we're not the government, so we can't agree this, but like having like minimum requirements for housing estates that do have like community gardens, do have playgrounds, do have, I don't know, I feel like we need to rethink how housing works anyway, because I think it's focused on like family and like nuclear family, and in my idea of the world, housing would be way more communal, obviously, but just like who do people live with like living with friends as adults isn't like a standard thing, like just thinking of housing beyond like a family space, I think is really important.
Helen, you're going to have to move into that commune with Fran. You have a look at it.
Just really quickly on that, so there's a campaign called Let's Play Fair, which is all about accessibility of play spaces, and is really, really important. And it's something that I've been doing a bit of work with the Great Park Consortium about their parks. And there's also an organisation called Scope who have been sort of being really public about it.
Yeah.
So
and it's also not just about the equipment in the park. I had a big cry at work the other day because a lot of my work at the minute is at Kingston Park Primary School, and they've got like a special unit who work with children with mobility needs. And one of those children is on the Eco Council, and we went out and did a 5-minute walk zone. And it's about encouraging kids to walk in school and what exciting things can see, and we do mini beast safaris and all that. And I absolutely sobbed because we had a TA with us and she was putting loads of effort into trying to get this little boy in his wheelchair. I don't know if any of you know Kingston Park, but from the school towards the metro station, there is a path through the park, but it's not particularly smooth and it's not particularly wide. So that is not the route that his parents taken. And he went out and he never realised there was a play park there. And he said that to the rest of the kids, not that, and he's taken a minute because he was so excited. And he talked about it for the rest of the day. And he was like, "There's a play park and and it's amazing." And like, there is stuff that you can go on, there is equipment, but you can't get to it all the time. So I think that's part of where the accessible active travel side of things comes in. Is like, even if we built all these amazing spaces, we need to make sure that kids can, all kids and everyone can get to them safely.
And I think obviously one of the things about Play Streets is that it's a space for playing on your doorstep. You don't have to go anywhere. You just have to open your door. And we've had all sorts of kind of stories and accounts in different parts of the UK about disabled children and neurodiverse children, for example, who's either for physical or other kinds of reasons struggle to get to play spaces that support them. But actually, then like literally their door is open and they can play with the kids on their street and they can meet kids. They're often being bused to schools that are further away and don't have that opportunity to kind of meet with their neighbours. And I think that's very true for kind of for disabled and neurodiverse children, but I think it's true for kind of all sorts of for children full stop, but also just to think about those questions of accessibility, that if children have safe space to play on their doorsteps, literally by opening their front doors, then that's not to say I'm talking about a 3-minute city, that's what we want. We don't.
Yeah.
But clearly we also want children to be able to kind of get into their neighbourhoods and beyond, to schools, to playgrounds and to parks and so on. But I think particularly for younger children as well, young children can't independently walk to a park, but they can possibly, and have done historically, play on their doorsteps. And I think so I think that those questions of kind of where we imagine children should play, and we create space for children to play, that it isn't just in play. I mean, it's really, playgrounds are incredibly important for all sorts of reasons, as are skate parks and all sorts of, but then for me, the kind of fundamental thing is that children should be able to play in their neighbourhoods wherever they choose. And that might not be anything that to us looks like a play space.
It's just a tree stuff to say.
Indeed.
Another question at the back.
Yeah, thank you. I just kind of wanted to hear the panel's thoughts. Thank you so much for all your contributions. I've just been totally glued on all your interesting insights. But one of the kind of uncomfortable truths that I always come back to with this kind of thing is that kind of in richer areas, there are always going to be people who can advocate for their children and for their spaces, for their parks, for their teenage zones, activities, clubs, music instruments, all cost a fortune. And then those areas where there isn't money for that kind of thing, that's where children and young people fall through the gaps a little bit, and that's why I spent my teenage years in the park learning musical instruments or whatever. But actually, from what a lot of you have been saying, I feel like the solutions might not be total systemic reform, so redesigning housing or transport, but actually just providing lighting in parks and benches, and maybe reclaiming some of those community spaces like schools that have room and space and are often just closed over weekends. And yeah, I was just kind of was wondering on your thoughts if there are any not small fixes but stuff that we can do and to support the work people are doing in academia and in schools and in sort of youth work that aren't ripping everything down and starting again.
I think absolutely the attitude towards young people and children needs to change. Particularly with antisocial behaviour, it's hard to describe because what exactly is antisocial behaviour? Is it just a group of young people standing outside a shop? That's considered antisocial behaviour? Because what harm are they really doing from standing outside waiting for their friends? I think I'm at university as well, and I'm currently learning a lot about attitudes towards young people and funding and all that stuff. I've been on placement this year, and my friend who because we get to decide our placements for our second year, she was in quite a wealthy area. They had a community hub, and she comes from a very different background. She grew up in the West End, she works in the West End. So the contrast was that she didn't get to do much like community engagement because they already had everything that they needed in that community, and they were still getting more money for like stuff that they didn't necessarily need, where like they wanted electric bikes, and like who's really going to use that electric bike because they all have cars, they all have their own modes of transport, where in this deprived area where there's not a lot of like money, there are kids who don't have bikes, kids who don't have scooters and all that stuff that are not getting that funding. And I think as well, we tend to like want to protect the young people, but we also think that they are naive and that they don't know, they don't have a lot of wisdom. But like you guys were saying, they have a lot of ideas about what they want to see in that area, and like it might be, so we might think it's crazy, but then why is it crazy? Because we had a project where we were working with developers as well, and they were like, oh, so what kind of stuff, like we were talking about the environment and stuff, and like what kind of things would you as young people would like to see in this area? And then one of them said, oh, it would be so cool to have like a cinema, like an outdoor cinema. That would be sick. But it was almost immediately shut down. It was like, well, we kind of don't really want that in this area. And it was like, why can't they have this in this area? And then it because the plans were already made, and like not many people would like to see this, and you know. Another thing was a pond. They really wanted some water feature, like some natural place where, you know, you could come sit and it would be really nice and pretty there. But then they were like, we don't really have the space for a pond, you know, it'd be hard to upkeep and all that stuff.
What was the answer they wanted?
Like, what did you think they were gonna say? Like, oh, some nice footpaths, you know, maybe like a Japanese garden or something.
I think there's a real challenge, isn't there, in terms of like if you like Newcastle's a footballing city, so you just go endless fields of football pitches, you know what I mean? And it's like, no, you know, in some and then some other spaces, you know what I mean? And I think I saw the plans for the development you're talking about, and yeah, it was just 5 side, you know, football pitches as far as a monoculture of that, and we try not to do a monoculture of anything else, you know, so why would it be like that in play, you know, and so often play can be, you know, and public spaces can be that, you know, and it just needs that diversity of the spaces, doesn't it, which comes from listening to communities, I guess, rather than imposing a top-down solution.
I feel like just coming back to your question, I've been working over the last kind of year or so with Leeds City Council, and Leeds have a very extensive play street scheme, which is run by the council through public health. But they recognised the fact that a lot of the streets that had kind of set up play streets were reasonably affluent, kind of people with a reasonable amount of kind of capacity to do that, both in terms of time and all sorts of other stuff. But they wanted, so they set up an enablement project, which was established to support play streets in communities that had struggled to do so, often didn't necessarily know that it was possible, and if they did know it was possible, didn't think they could do it. So the council worked with a bunch of very embedded community groups, youth work organisations that had existing and strong relationships in neighbourhoods and on streets and with particular families, kind of explored the possibility, and so running traditional play streets in the sense of kind of closing off streets, but also thinking about kind of how space might be reclaimed in these communities, whether it was a car park at the bottom of a tower block, for example, or just a bit of green space that wasn't particularly kind of used or animated by residents. And so that scheme's been running for about the last 2 years or so, and I did an evaluation of that, and I mean obviously we've identified tons of obstacles. You know, there were, again, predominantly women. There were some amazing women who had set up play streets on their streets when they'd had arson attacks on cars on their streets like 2 weeks earlier, and all sorts of, but also some really, really kind of low level but kind of serious kind of, you know, sort of toxic environments, fly tipping, waste, you know, and not surprisingly weren't particularly happy about letting their kids play out in these spaces. So there were some really, really serious issues, but what was also clear was when this was made possible, with an awful lot of support from these locally trusted organisations, from these embedded community groups with funding from the council, was that it was an opportunity then for residents to come together, to start talking to each other, to start then, so this is kind of one of the reasons why I'm kind of interested in thinking about kind of play streets and environmental justice, because what we see is residents coming together going, actually it's not okay, like the kind of hand we're being dealt is shit and it's not okay, and actually like there's loads of us here that really want to do something about it. And and because of the nature of this, like I was kind of saying at the beginning, this is about play, it's about kids, it's about kind of families coming together. It becomes quite a powerful kind of catalyst for conversation, for change, for recognising actually that we have the right to claim this space. It is ours, and we're claiming it for us and for our children. And I'm not going to kind of romanticise that process. It's not easy, and it can be very slow, and it can be a very stop-start. But it is really clear that, like, I suppose that once a bunch of neighbours start thinking about the fact that they do want to hang out in these spaces, that they do want them to be a part of their community, then they start asking questions about why it's so rubbish. Speeding cars, dog shit, dumped rubbish, in various instances, like councils just taking over huge bits of space in their in their play parks for like storing, I don't know, road signs and all sorts of just stuff that's just put in the so I think it's some really kind of rubbish stories, but then a few kind of really strong examples of these communities suddenly going actually and it's not, like I said, it's not straightforward and it's not without conflict, but like suddenly going actually and with the support, the kind of authority and responsibility taken on by other people within the community as well, and funding, so there's some really interesting kind of possibilities, I think, but it's tough when it's but there's some really good stuff happening.
If I can kind of add to that as well, because we talked already about the top level approach and the bottom level approach when it comes to developers. I think when it comes to advocating for people as well, you've got to take that. So community groups, hugely important, those collections of people, and I might be about to drop Mike in it as well, as elected representatives, it's ultimately incumbent on us to ensure that we are advocating for everybody in our communities. And I think that we play a huge role in making sure that everybody has a voice, and if the people who you are choosing aren't actually giving people a voice, then you have that opportunity to say, actually we want somebody who will listen to us, somebody who will advocate for us, because ultimately, that's what we are there for, to ensure that every resident, no matter if you are, one of the multi-millionaires who lives on the Great Park, who I happen to represent, or somebody who's in a YHM property that's full of mould and damp and hasn't been listened to, again, who I also represent, no matter which end of that spectrum you are on, it's for us to go, we are lucky enough to get a seat at, not the table we necessarily want over there, but a seat at that table and say, you need to be doing better and advocate for those people. So I think it is really important that people do engage with their local representatives and say, your job is to advocate for me, your job is to ensure that I have a voice, and if you're not doing that, bugger off.
Yeah, don't say it exactly like that, otherwise they might start ignoring your emails. But just very quickly going back to your original question, I think I've the two things. Firstly, I don't know if Lindsay's still here. This is a really, really small thing. Lindsay is the chair of the Newcastle Cycling Campaign, and is also in the Gosforth Residents Group, which I happen to also be in, and spends an unholy amount of time replying to people complaining about, usually children, but sometimes for adults, cycling on Gosforth High Street. And she will get in and she will get into an argument with literally anyone who's like, what a cyclist is on here? And she's like, well, actually, they're just trying to get to where they're going. Like she gets some interesting comments back, and I'm not sure she's the most well-liked person in that Facebook group, but does get out there and stick up for people. And it doesn't necessarily take a whole load of effort. Just reply, like we get in the Great Park Residents Group. There'll be people who they post pictures of kids who are just walking in the street after dark, and then it got real weird for a little while, and now people have started replying to it being like, are they causing any bother? No, just leave them to it. And I think even a comment as small as that, it feels tiny, it might not make you feel great about yourself, but it's a little thing that you can do. And also I imagine from the questions and discussions that we've had, a load of people in here work in community settings or work with young people. just, sorry if I'm teaching you all to suck eggs, but like being really aware of who you're actually hearing from. One of the things that we want to do with school streets is do them where they're wanted, right? We don't want to impose things on communities, even though we think they're great. So we get loads of requests in, and it's fantastic. And I started the job and I was like, oh my god, everyone's emailing me and asking for school streets, and it's so good. And they're like, they're so clued up on active travel. And then I mapped out where all those schools that had requested them were, and I was like, oh dear. Because they are the people who have the resource, the time to advocate for that. Like I've got some schools who don't want to work with us on school streets because they're trying to meet like their minimum for Ofsted, like that is their priority. So they're not reaching out to us and asking for this thing, and we're still trying to navigate a way that we can work with them to do either a school street or active travel promotion or something that works for them, but they're the people who we weren't hearing from. It also goes for school streets in other bits of the country where they have physical closures. A lot of them are managed by volunteers, and we've got a bit of an issue with schemes in more deprived areas failing because they can't recruit and retain the volunteers who manage the closure, because people are working different shift patterns. They're not working from home, so they need to leg it after the school run. Like, it's all that kind of like detail that you need to be thinking about when you're working in your own community project, or I don't know, Rachel, one that you're like advising on or whatever. Who you're hearing from and who is volunteering from your community, because it's really easy to go down the easy route, but then you're leaving a whole bunch of people behind.
We have time for one more comment or question, either from the panel or from...
I was about to add on that.
So that's it, you have the final word.
So I tell on the fact that some groups of people are basically not being heard. I feel like young people between the ages of like 10 to 18 are usually the ones that in development plans anyway, they don't get think of, so because they would always attach them to like family groups or family groups. So you get things like activities for young people, or like young people like children, or family orientated activities. So I was part of this talk that's happening that is currently happening in Sunderland, which is their Resurrection City. They're trying to make Sunderland more appealing, kind of like a second Newcastle, but don't quote me on that. And they wanted someone who has had a background with working with kids and community and art as well, because usually within kids they tend to work with art workshops, and that's what they would like to do. And what I've noticed in this development, so they've had a bunch of like new offices, and they have this they're adding like a footpath across the bridge, and across from that footpath there's this like little festival, like outdoor area where students, since Sunderland Sunderland is uni orientated, they want to cater it more to students. But what I wasn't hearing is how about young people that are like just in the streets because they have nowhere else to go, and I felt like it was just ridiculous how they were talking about community and development, and they were hitting the right businesses and entrepreneurship and income generating into the city, but there wasn't any talk of how the kids that are independent enough to go out and without their parents to do something. So yeah, it was just a bit of add-on from a lecture, but like that was a while ago. So yeah.
Well, we'll draw things to a close. Thank you ever so much for coming. Thank you very much to our panel as well for some really fantastic contributions. Please give